So first of all, apologies for the really ugly slides. I am not a great designer. I want to talk about this word that you hear a lot. Different permutations: digital sovereignty, tech sovereignty, data sovereignty. Demystify it, and then try and think in practical terms how we deal with the world where these words matter. It's important to, go back to the roots of sort of sovereignty and how we've talked about it for the last couple of centuries. It's a very, in a broader sense, it's older even in the 17th century, but our modern concepts of sovereignty really come from the 17th century. There's the idea of the sovereignty of the state, the sovereign, the authority that governs a piece of territory, and the modern definition of the state is the entity that exercises a monopoly on the legitimate use of force in a certain area. But there's also, beyond the collective sovereignty of states, the sovereignty of the individual. Again, a 17th century idea that every man, it was a sexist era, is sovereign over his castle, so kind of a mini version of a sovereign at home, and ideas that we developed from that around the inviolability of the personal home, privacy, which has come from that, and many of our modern liberal conceptions of human autonomy. But all of these ideas of both the sovereign state and the sovereign individual, they're very much grounded in a physical world. And of course, as we've been discussing, we now live in a world where there's a virtual layer overlaid to the physical layer. It could be a cityverse, it could be whatever. And so we're no longer just living in the world of atoms, we're living in a dematerialized world of electrons. And those electrons don't as easily fall into, sovereign borders. And so we've been dealing with this problem for quite some time already, and I'm going to remind you of some things you should all be familiar with. 13 years ago, the US took advantage of the fact that all of our social interactions were flowing through their networks to tap into Google and Facebook data for good reasons, to catch terrorists. But of course, a lot of people didn't like it because suddenly the private communication and the sort of domestic conversation was not so private. We have the possibility technologically for a company like Huawei, or for that matter, in theory, Nokia or Ericsson, to insert itself into a country's telecoms infrastructure and hoover that data up. We have an interesting clash recently between the private sovereignty of individuals existing in this virtual world that Apple has built versus the state sovereignty of wanting to see people's communications. And we could go on and on. We can talk about the recent intervention, if you want to call it that, of TikTok in Romanian elections and other situations where social media, again, platforms that are extraterritorial have played in many democratic discourses. And of course, recently, there's the question of technology dependence here in Europe on the US that has been worrying us quite a lot, and which we'll be talking about. And I think it's important to note that this discourse isn't going to slow down or stop, and as we have new permutations of technology, it's going to get more and more intense. So something that people have been thinking about, we haven't seen it yet, is that we're getting to a point with neurotechnology where the sort of basic sovereignty of the individual to control his or her thoughts may also not be a given. And so we might have to start talking about cognitive or neurological sovereignty on top of everything else. And there have been a couple of people who have tried to kind of think through what this digital era, this dematerialized era, means for our old concepts of sovereignty. And I just want to mention two in particular. The first of these, Balaji Srinivasan, he is a Silicon Valley investor and company founder. He's been an evangelist of the idea of the network state, that a lot of the functions that a state provides may no longer be bound to territory. And indeed, he was inspired in many ways by what he saw in Estonia a decade ago: data embassies, digital identity, e-residency. And he's postulated that we could build these network states that wouldn't take over all the functions of physical sovereigns, but could take over many. They could be democratic communities and so on. And a bit in answer to this idea, there's a second thinker, Bruno Maçães, former Portuguese foreign minister, who's partially agreed with this notion. He sort of taken it a bit further and said that, look, let's think of the virtual world that we live in. Let's use the analogy of a video game or a computer game. We have artificial worlds. They've been constructed with software, but there are people who build those worlds that we're playing in, or who build the social network platforms that we're in. And what he says is, look, we don't need to talk about some kind of future network state that's different, that's diverse and separate from the sovereigns, because we already have the network states. We've got two of them. Effectively, he says, the world that we really all inhabit virtually, it's either built by the US or China. And that pretty much anyone else is playing in some combination of those two worlds. That, of course, is kind of not the most encouraging thing to hear if you're not the US or China. Unfortunately, right now, it seems to be backed up by history of the last decade or so, and also what we see now happening in the world of AI. We look at who is building AI models. Basically, US, China, and rest of the world maybe competes like for a quarter. Similarly, we look at who is founding AI companies, who's getting AI patents. It's US, China, and then the rest of the world's kind of playing along. And so in that sense, the world we're heading toward in AI space in the next big technological revolution is a world being built effectively by these two large network states that happen to also be very large physical states. And all the resources that they have, and all the talents they have, sometimes controlled by the state, sometimes not. Indeed, if there is going to be a competitor, I don't think it's going to be any other traditional state. It may not even be human intelligence. It may be that if anyone can kind of break out of that, it's artificial intelligence. And I just want to put two sort of things together here, which we're now starting to see slowly together in the wild. The first is that AI can replicate itself. That, it's still early days, but you have AIs now that are not dependent on humans setting up all their environments, and so they can go out in the wild and do things. They may not be artificial general intelligence that think exactly the way humans do, but they certainly interact with that world. And out of the Web3 sort of wave of the last couple of years, we also have distributed compute and distributed file sharing, which gets paid for by cryptocurrencies. It's censorship resistant. So we put together the idea of a censorship resistant AI that's living somewhere in the network. They might be unbound by the network states of China and the US, but I'm not sure anyone else is. And so that raises the question, where does it leave the rest of us, this happy UN of humanity that are not American and Chinese? And I should add, where does it leave a lot of American and Chinese who are not their state or some of those tech companies, because they have the exact same question within those systems? And I want to start off by working through three approaches that don't solve the problem, that are unsatisfactory. It doesn't mean they're wrong entirely, but they really don't get at the heart of the problem. The first of those is to approach this situation through control and rules. Someone here said the GDPR is a success. I think it was the automobile. I'm sorry, it's not. Total failure. First of all, the way it's been implemented has led to a massive break on innovation in Europe. And the second thing is that we're now seeing that the cost of this is that Europe thought, okay, we're a big enough market, we'll force everyone to follow rules. Well, a lot of companies now are saying, maybe I just won't come to the European market, or I'll come later once I've figured things out. And so that doesn't mean we shouldn't have rules, but if we try and think, if we think that just with having control and rules and regulation we can govern this, it's not going to work. The second is building specialized bubbles in kind of niches. So this is a nice visualization of the Estonian digital ecosystem, X-Road. In a sense, what Estonia has done is on certain parts of the layers of the technological stack for a certain ecosystem, it is built through a combination of open source and openness and its own standards, an ecosystem that it controls and can govern pretty well and solve some of these problems. And that works, but it's not a universal solution. It's not going to address all the levels of dependency in the stack, and it may not scale to the political economy of Europe or the world. And the third approach is something that now Europe is taking pretty seriously, which is the idea of, well, let's build our own end-to-end tech stack, a Euro stack. And while this might seem attractive, the reality is that we're so far behind that if we try and replicate the full layer of all of these technologies, we will just waste massive resources, and we probably will still fail. Which isn't to say that we shouldn't do this in some levels of the stack, but the trick is, where do we focus? And so this brings us to the sovereignty, or the digital sovereignty dilemma, which is, we clearly don't like this situation where a lot of the world around us is going to be built by a combination of China, the US, and the AIs, with us having not too much of a role. But focusing on sovereignty as a concept may distract us from some more achievable things, practical autonomy and empowerment that we want. And I'm going to sort of lay out some elements of this dilemma. I mean, this is kind of a stack of some of the key technologies. it kind of optimistically says that we play a role in software and IoT, or at least Germany does. Realistically, it's a little iffy. It just kind of visualizes the problem. Realistically, Europe's got an entry in networking thanks to Nokia and Ericsson, something of an entry in chips, but even it's more on the level of the whole supply chain for chips, not actually making the chips, and that's it. So like, if we tried to replicate an end-to-end sovereign stack in Europe, the volume of investments, the volume of things you have to get right, really, really tough. Now, when people look at what's going on in AI right now, they think, yes, but look, the infrastructure and the semiconductor, the physical layers are making so much money and are so important that clearly we should pour in our resources there. But what we see from previous technological revolutions is that is a moving target, and that phenomenon may not obtain over time. So if we go back to the mobile era, initially all the money was made by the semiconductor manufacturers, by Qualcomm, by ARM. And then the profit shifted to the device manufacturers, but over time it was really ultimately the applications and the service providers on top that collected a large volume of the profit. And the lower levels of the stack became commoditized over time, and that didn't mean those companies weren't important, couldn't be critical, but they weren't necessarily driving economic value. We see this in AI too, right? Foundation models are getting super cheap. Part of that is just Moore's law, part of that is being role played by open source. And so it's hard to make profit off of just having a foundation model. And so people speculate, but it is a speculation that analogously where we're going to go to in AI is that the opportunities are on top in the application layer. And this brings us to the dilemma, right? Which is, if we're purely asking in economic terms, we want to make massive money off of AI, we are where we are now, it probably makes sense to put a lot of our attention, our effort collectively into changing a whole bunch of worlds, a whole bunch of ecosystems, sectors, using AI, building the applications to capture value. But, and this is a thing that many, many people, including Bruno, would point out to you, in reality, the entities that control those worlds can always tilt the game to be in their favor. So you might want to go build an application that takes a lot of value, gets too big. Well, if someone else has a chokehold on the infrastructure, or the hardware, they might be able to squeeze your profits. And so this is a dilemma. There is no easy answer. All that I want to do is offer you some practical ideas. This is not a coherent solution or a strategy. It's a bit of a random collection, and I will warn you this is highly opinionated, so feel free to disagree. The first one, probably everyone will agree on this one, is just to build up competence, to actually understand this world, know how it works on an individual level, on a collective level. So something like pushing for universal uptake, what Estonia is doing now with AI in education, and I hope across society, a brilliant thing to do. Just everything you can do to encourage everyone to be experimenting, deploying things, building apps. And the tricky thing is to keep up to speed with all the tooling. Because if you thought, okay, I know what the AI stack is, I'm going to build my own version 6 months ago, well, everything's changed. Like every week right now in AI world, boom, everything changes. And so that's really tricky to do, and it's hard to do at a systems level. So I'm not going to say it's easy to do this, but this is the first thing you have to do. You just have to be in the game. The second, this is going to be a little bit more controversial, is when it comes to data, like most of us, when we think about data protection, data security, we really focus on the confidentiality of our data. And I'm going to argue that that is a mistaken focus, and for a couple of reasons. One is that, frankly, data is not that valuable anymore on the level of like your data, your little specific granular bit of data in this big world. We've gotten to a point where the AI foundational models are trained on the whole data of the world. And we're running out of data, and everyone's making synthetic data. So like, what is the value of your specific data set in that massive mixture? There is value, we'll get to that. On the other hand, the integrity of your data and the availability, like, can you actually access it? Is it there? Or has someone, taken down the cloud service? That really matters, because that gets in the way of you doing your things. Like, just to be really blunt about it, if someone compromises the confidentiality of your data, that doesn't prevent you from continuing to operate. That may have other implications. It may be bad, but losing the integrity or the basic availability of your data is catastrophic. And that's not to say confidentiality doesn't matter, but I think a lot of people overemphasize it. Now, data quality and governance in a broader sense still matter, and are still very important, but it's worth being nuanced in what has changed and what hasn't changed in the Gen AI era. So I think a couple things that haven't changed. High quality data are the rails for automation. We know this very well in Estonia. If you have a single identity, a single tag for all the references to an individual, you can automate services. If you don't, you have collisions. It's a mess. Garbage in, garbage out matters to the AI too. But unstructured data, which used to be unusable, or where you thought, okay, like I'm going to do a huge amount of work to put this into a more standardized format to deal with things being uneven, can be much more usable. So it matters whether that unstructured data is garbage or not, but merely the fact of it being messy and unstructured doesn't make it garbage. And that's a gift that Gen AI has given us. And then there's the question of data value. I mean, let's be very frank. You know, we've got people, including Estonia, think, I've got a high-value data set. I'm sitting on it. I'm going to sell the data to someone. I'm going to make lots of money off of it. No, you're not. The money is in the value you create off the data. Yes, someone might throw away a few millions for a health data set, but the billions are in building the next generation of health applications. The same thing is true for mobility data, energy data, et cetera. So really focus on what you do with your data, not the idea that it's some bit of oil or gold that you're going to hand off to others. Which doesn't mean we're not going to have bloody fights over IP and data, but it's, I think, worth those IP holders also bearing in mind in those discussions that, you know, the absolute value of their data, as data, it's there, it's not massive, it's the utility. Next, avoid lock-in. So this is super important. You may not want to, you may not be able to build your own end-to-end stack, but you want to get good at multi-homing. So open source, open data, open weights, that's always really useful. That will cover some things, but it won't be a universal solution. Where you can be vendor neutral in your architectures, and have failover plans so someone goes away, have a backup plan, and be very cautious where there's only one provider, where you've got the NVIDIA chips or the Starlink. And then taking those principles in mind, be really selective on where you build your own. It's not saying don't build your own solutions, and obviously with Gen AI, hey, we can all code apps in like 5 minutes. But be selective on where you invest the effort of building your own thing. Whether you as a state or an assembly of states like Europe, you as a city, try and reuse what's out there as much as you can, but be ready when you have to build your own. And now for what I think will be the most controversial slide, worry less about regulation. And I'm not, Europe, that's a collective thing, but like, very bluntly, dear cities, part of the impact of GDPR has not been that the GDPR says to do things that are bad and expensive, but everyone becomes super risk averse. There's a lawyer that comes and says, well, I'm not sure this could be a risk, maybe we shouldn't do it, and that becomes don't do it. So I'm going to say some really like politically incorrect things, because why is everyone worried about the GDPR? Because of the fines. If you look at the fines, you can actually download the database. These days you can use ChatGPT to analyze, which I did yesterday, sort of who gets fined for what. Basically, there are 3 things that get you big fines. If you're a big tech company, you get big fines because, that's fair, actually. Like, that's your operating model dealing with data. You should be good at this. And you could dispute the individual fine decisions, but I don't think it's morally problematic. It isn't morally problematic that a big tech company might get a $10 or $100 million fine if they're really doing something wrong. Second reason you get big fines, poor cybersecurity. There's no excuse for not just being competent in your cybersecurity, and a lot of the big fines are because of data breaches that occur for embarrassing reasons. And the third category is you do something like obviously unethical and bad. Like the Austrian Post, I think, got the 3rd highest fine in GDPR history because they were just like completely without any regard for the rules, selling the data to advertisers that they had of their users. And they were a state institution on top, or a semi-state. Everyone else basically gets pretty small slap-on-the-wrist fines, and most regulators take the approach we actually want to help people do a good job, not go around punishing them. So you can get worried about all the intricacies, or you can follow the spirit of the law, try and follow, but just go and do it, and take the risks. If you're in Estonia, the Estonian Data Protection Authority really doesn't fine at all. And just obsess less about this. The regulation's there for a reason, but it's not meant to be a straitjacket. And finally, aim high. Set big goals. And I've put up here kind of verbatim a pretty large section of an essay that Mark Andreessen wrote last year titled Why AI Will Save the World. It's worth reading. You don't have to agree with him on everything, but he kind of lays out the positive case for all the good things that Gen AI could do. And I'll leave this up and you can read through this, but it's one example of the sort of optimistic, disruptive thinking. And my kind of call to action to all the cities here, to everyone who's solving the types of problems that we have to in the context of smart cities is, solve a big problem. Because if you solve a big problem, a lot of the other things will fall into place. as a result of solving the big problem. You'll have to worry about having good data. You'll have to worry about a good development pipeline. You'll have to worry about the competence of people. And so like, instead of all these abstractions of thinking of like a 28-step model for doing things right and being super anxious, solve the big problem and let that problem drive the solutions. And I think if you do that, you will not solve the digital sovereignty dilemma, but you'll find yourself to a sort of an equilibrium where you actually get done what you want to get done, you figure out a degree of autonomy, and you live your life. So don't worry, be happy, use AI. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luukas. And you can still ask questions. I would advise you to do it pretty quick. But is there any questions from audience? Who wants to raise your hand? Okay, while they're thinking, I've got a quick question. Since you're now working also in Ukraine,
yes.
Is there anything we can learn, not just Estonia, but maybe the rest of the world, from Ukraine and their digital experience and solutions?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, Ukraine is a case study in necessity being the mother of invention. Obviously, the last 3 years have been a pretty shitty case of necessity, but it's also led to more innovation in military AI and drones in the last 3 years than we've seen, I would say, in the world in the last 30. And what Ukraine is now trying to itself figure out is, can it take that process and reapply it to the challenges they're going to have in the civilian world as they rebuild, as they deal with 1 million demobilized soldiers and hundreds of thousands of amputees, and the list of challenges is really long. So in some sense, there's value to having your back against the wall. And if anything, what's happened in Estonia is we've all gotten a little bit too comfortable, a little bit too lazy. I think that the existential challenge of security threats is helpful. The other thing that they've been very good at is, and I'm not saying Estonia is bad at this, but they've been very good at doing like domestic innovation, but also welcoming in innovators from across the world. So you look at what they did in drones, what they've done with their kind of military tech. They've set up Brave One as an accelerator for the world. Anyone from a friendly country who's doing a dev tech innovation, send them an email, send them a deck, and they will find a way for you to be in Ukraine, as many Estonian companies are, testing your solution. And so I think, I'd say for Estonia, we know everything we need to do. We have all the programs to do it, but it's an execution problem. And sometimes, like with Accelerate Estonia, I was on the mission board for a while. The problem was not the great ideas. The challenge was when you get into the friction of, well, there's legislation we have to change, there's a lot of work, sometimes you lost the energy. And so just keep at it.
Thanks. Jorma had a question there. We'll get you a microphone as well. Okay, sure. If your voice is quite loud. Yeah. We've got a microphone for you.
I'm not particularly familiar, famous for my quiet voice. Anyway, thanks, great presentation. One question about the bubbles. Wouldn't it still be beneficial, for example, to consider kind of a tech stack approach in certain domains? Let's take the obvious example of safety critical, defense critical tech stack. Wouldn't that be something we just should have?
Yeah. So I think this, yes, comma, and there's two provisos. The first is, and what frustrates me with the Eurostack approach is that it's European. Like, we don't like the idea of being stuck in an American or a Chinese stack that is kind of end-to-end controlled. But does that mean we have to build our own closed thing? Like maybe through a combination of open standards, a process and governance, we can build a global stack that's more open. And so I would say if we're going to take the resources we have in Europe, the market demand we do have, then let's find a way to not say no to the 5 billion users, consumers, people, the 160 states that are not Europe, the US, or China. Like, let's get them also to want to be on the same platform with us. And the second thing is, like, absolutely, those bubbles should be built. I just wanted to say, like, those are not a coherent, systematic solution. And I think that there are people who say, oh, well, look, we've got our little ecosystem and it's great, so where's the issue? And we know very well in Estonia that like we're dependent on so many layers of the stack that aren't built by us, and that we don't control, that like those can come and bite us in the proverbial behind.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have to move on, but thank you, Luukas, Kristjan, again for that.
Thank you.
Applause for you.